All right, so in the wake of the mass shooting at the elementary school in Uvalde, Texas, we have seen plenty of deranged reactionary takes from conservatives blaming basically everything except for the proliferation of guns in this country for mass shootings. And I got a new take here that I haven't heard yet, this time from Laura Ingraham's show on Fox News. Short little clip here of her blaming marijuana use for the rise in violence and mass shootings here in the United States. So let's go ahead and watch this clip.
It was initially reported that he was a user. In fact, he got angry that his grandmother and his mother didn't want him to use marijuana. But again, we don't know more. It was just mysteriously taken out of an article in the New York Times. But why aren't people in general not talking more about the pot, psychosis, violent behavior connection?
Well, that's a very good question, Laura.
Well, I mean, no, it's not. It's not a good question. It is, in fact, a pretty stupid question. But if we wanted to be as good faith as possible and actually get into somewhat of a response to the perceived connection between marijuana use and mass shootings, well, I mean, we could talk about the specifics of the Uvalde shooting, in which there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever, even as she admitted in that segment there, there's no evidence whatsoever that in this specific case there was any link between his violence and marijuana usage whatsoever. No evidence that we know of whatsoever for that. But just in the general point on whether or not there is a linkage between marijuana usage and violence generally, well, here from PolitiFact, we got a little bit of a breakdown on another Fox News commentator, this time the white nationalist propagandist Tucker Carlson, who made similar claims in the wake of a different mass shooting, also trying to form a correlation between marijuana usage and violence. And listen, I mean, we're going to read through this, but basically the core of their argument is that because in some fringe cases on the margins, people who are otherwise genetically or environmentally susceptible to illnesses such as schizophrenia, because there is some evidence that sustained marijuana usage over time can increase the likelihood of you developing the symptoms related to schizophrenia, that therefore there is a direct correlation between marijuana and violence that a schizophrenic person may or may not commit. So it's a pretty tenuous connection, to say the least, but again, here from PolitiFact, they give us a little bit more details in terms of why this is not based in any evidence or science whatsoever. So they say in the weeks since the attacks in Texas and Ohio, note this is from 2019, so they're actually talking about a different attack in Texas at the time. And they say in the wake of the attacks in Texas and Ohio, politicians and pundits have pointed the blame for mass shootings in several different directions. Some called out current gun laws, some faulted white supremacy or Donald Trump's rhetoric on immigrants, others blamed video games or prescription drugs. And they say Fox News talk show host Tucker Carlson has a new hypothesis to explain why people commit acts of extreme violence: marijuana. And they say during an August 27th interview with former New York Times reporter Alex Berenson, Carlson noted that Dayton, Ohio shooter had cocaine, Xanax, and alcohol in his system when he attacked. Notably, none of the three things that they just listed here are marijuana, but these are other things that I guess you could make a much more substantial argument that do lead to violent outcomes, especially in the case of like alcohol or cocaine. I mean, I could definitely see a correlation there. I mean, how many times do you hear about like drunk bar fights and shit like that? It's very common. It happens all the time. And so, you know, I think there would be much more of a correlation to draw here between a lot of these other drugs than there would be for marijuana. But notice how nobody, including Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham, are calling to outlaw alcohol or anything like that. But they continue with a quote here saying, he was also known to be a longtime user of marijuana. Carlson said, it turns out, in fact, that many violent individuals have been avid marijuana users. Is there a connection? And they say Berenson replied that marijuana and violence are indeed linked because cannabis can cause the onset of psychosis, which can in turn lead to violence. That's the finding at the heart of his new book, Tell Your Children the Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness, and Violence. And he said, quote, so I don't think that it's going way out on a limb to draw the connection then between cannabis use, particularly I assume chronic use, and acts of violence. Carlson replied, why is this not something we're pursuing more aggressively? And they say in the past, we've debunked claims that mass shootings could be fueled by psychiatric drugs or Ritalin, a prescription drug for attention deficit hyperactive hyperactivity disorder. And they say we also rated a 2014 claim that people on pot shoot each other, stab each other, strangle each other, drive under the influence, and kill families as mostly false. Yeah, seems like a little bit of a stretch there. But they say from talking to experts, we found that Berenson's book goes far beyond what the available science actually shows, and Carlson offers no pushback as he praised Berenson for being a voice in the wilderness, whatever the fuck that means, giving viewers the wrong impression about a cannabis link to violence, and the reality is that there is no scientific consensus. So yeah, I mean, basically what we all kind of, I guess, intuitively understand, especially if you are somebody who smokes weed on a regular basis. I personally do smoke weed on a regular basis. I know plenty of people in my life that also smoke weed on a regular basis, and believe it or not, most of the things that you're doing when you're high are like, I don't know, playing video games, watching TV, watching a movie, eating a bunch of food, etc. Those are the types of things that you feel the urge to do when you're high. So, you know, this correlation between that and violence, if anything, I would probably make the argument and, you know, place my bet that there is an inverse correlation between marijuana use and violence. But nonetheless, they're trying to make this argument based on, again, no scientific consensus whatsoever. Now, this isn't the only bullshit argument that we have seen put forward by conservatives and reactionaries in basically an attempt to divert all attention away from the glaring problems of the proliferation of guns in this country. But just to remind you of some of the more recent ones that we had in the wake of the Buffalo and Uvalde shootings. So here from Yahoo News, they say Fox News is already using violent video games as a scapegoat for mass shootings. Again, you don't really have to do too much thinking to debunk a lot of these points, because plenty of other countries around the world, including ones that you can make fair comparisons to the United States on, also have a lot of the same violent video games that we have, and yet don't have the same amount of gun violence or mass shootings in their countries. Again, plenty of other countries have as much, if not more, marijuana usage than the United States. Still don't have a problem with mass shootings or gun violence in the same way that we do. We also had Texas Senator Ted Cruz blaming doors instead of guns for the mass shooting. So basically his point was that we need to make schools into tiny little police states where we have multiple armed guards positioned all over the schools. Teachers are armed, hell, maybe even students are armed. You only have one point of entry, even though that would be a massive fire hazard, it seems like. But, you know, basically pushing for every single thing under the sun except for reducing the amount of guns in this country. And finally, to finish us off with a couple more here from The Hill, they say other Republicans have offered even more far-fetched explanations for the massacre. Senator Mike Lee from Utah suggested that fatherless families might contribute to gun violence, and the 15-year-old who killed 4 students in Oxford, Michigan, lived with both of his parents who bought him the gun that he used in the attack. Kind of counter to his point there. And they say the 15.3 million children being raised by single mothers are no more likely to engage in violence than anyone else. Of course, that's pretty obvious when you think about it, but even the extent to which you want to make the argument along fatherlessness in this country, well, you know, a disproportionate amount of specifically minority communities that do have higher rates of fatherlessness, you can blame conservative ideology for that in the first place, whether it's by increasing poverty in this country, or whether it's by the ongoing war on drugs or the ongoing problem of mass incarceration that we have in this country and have had for decades. Those are the kinds of things that you would address if you actually believed in addressing the issue of fatherlessness. But nonetheless, it doesn't seem like there's much of a correlation between that and mass shootings. But we finish off here with, of course, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene from my home state of Georgia, who also jumped in on the mental health bandwagon, but added her own bizarre twist to the debate, saying, "We don't need more gun control. We need to return to God." Apparently, no one told her that Texas is one of the most religious observant states in the country, with 69% of its residents professing a belief in God with absolute certainty, and 63% saying that they pray daily. So again, I mean, all of these different arguments that you want to get into, whether it's on a lack of godliness in this country, as if the problem is that we didn't sit down these mass shooters and tell them, hey, did you know that God thinks that killing a bunch of kids is a bad thing, actually? You know, as if that's the problem, or as if a lack of militarized schools is the problem, or as if marijuana is the problem, or any host of the other issues that they were talking about in a lot of these bullshit arguments that they've been putting forward. Clearly, they're just avoiding the root of this problem, which is, again, the guns in this country. Okay, I'm not the biggest supporter of like stringent gun laws. I believe that people should be able to own guns if they can demonstrate that they're responsible gun owners, and that they're going to be safe and understand how to store them and understand how to use them in the right context, and maybe you have like mental health screening, and you have basic systems in place to make sure, or to try to reduce the likelihood that somebody who is going to do a mass shooting is going to be able to get their hands on one of these mass murder machines. But instead of talking about any of those potential solutions, instead of even talking about guns outside of the context of putting more guns in schools and more guns in the hands of Americans, they're just completely avoiding the root of the problem, because they understand that the only factor that makes the United States stand outside of the bounds of what the rest of the world considers normal is our gun culture. Really, that's all that it comes down to. And they're just going to continue and continue deflecting away with this, with every single thing that they can conjure up in their minds outside of reducing the amount of guns in this country.